And I said, you call Dr. Robert.
Hi, Dr. Robert Selig, and today in this presentation I want to talk about zinc and stomach acid, because if you don't make stomach acid, you do not absorb zinc. If you do not absorb zinc, you do not make stomach acid. That is the zinc stomach acid conundrum. And we're going to take a deeper look into this whole mechanism. You know, first and foremost, if you have deficient stomach acid, that beautiful gastric juice, if you're deficient in it, you don't have a first line defense. You know, so we need that stomach acid around 1.5 to 3. If you have that strong acid, it will render any bacterial infection, viral infection, mycotoxin, it will destroy it, so these pathogens won't have a chance to colonize into the small intestine and then to go rogue and systemic throughout the whole body with chronic infection after chronic infection. So when you have stomach acid, that is your first line defense. The classic example is H. pylori, that very obnoxious bacterial infection that affects actually half of the world's population has H. pylori, because half of the world's population at least is deficient in stomach acid. So we have to make this stomach acid connection to our first line defense, because all healing begins in the gut. Hippocrates told us that from day one, and every doctor that's taken the Hippocratic Oath knows this. So the great mavericks that, you know, have laid the foundation to natural medicine and functional medicine have always talked about how important it is to heal the gut. The Bernard Jensens, the Samuel Hahnemans, all the great clinicians of old always told us heal the gut. And to do that, we have to understand the mineral connection. We have to understand, you know, what is this stomach acid, because it is your first line defense. Now, the medical savants were telling us that H. pylori thrives in a acid environment. Well, that could not be further from the truth, you know, and they wanted to sell you their billion-dollar baby, those proton pump inhibitors, to suppress the hydrogen to making your stomach acid. So, think of a hydrogen is a proton, is an acid. The definition of an acid is its ability to donate a hydrogen, which is a proton. Remember, hydrogen is number 1 on the periodic table, so it has 1 proton. So when you think of a hydrogen, it is a proton, it is an acid. So we have to understand that, you know, we're making, in making stomach acid, how important the hydrogen ion is. And so they were trying to tell us that H. pylori thrives in this acid environment, so they can come up with their billion-dollar drug, the proton pump inhibitor. So the corollary to that is, if you have stomach acid and it's in that 1.5 to 3 range, it will render any pathogen, it will destroy it, neutralize it, eat it alive. And so this is why we have to understand that H. pylori and all these infections are because we have not enough stomach acid. All right, so this is where we always have to question things and dig a little bit deeper. Now, we said that stomach acid is our first line defense. Stomach acid is how we absorb nutrient minerals, specifically calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc. So very important, because it's going to put the mineral in the right valency, and it's also going to activate the vitamins, B9, B12, vitamin C, ascorbic acid, and vitamin A and vitamin E. So again, a lot of nutrient deficiencies, whether minerals or vitamins, is because we don't produce sufficient stomach acid. When you get that GERD, that acid reflux, that is happening because you do not have sufficient stomach acid to break down the foodstuffs. So the food starts to ferment into your area, because these bacteria thrive in a low acid environment. So you got the bacteria and the food stuff causing the fermentation because you don't have the stomach acid to break it down. And as a result of the fermentation, you're going to get a lot of hydrogen gas. You're going to get a lot of acids coming up, the lactic acids and other acids. It's not the hydrochloric acid, it's the other acids as a result of the fermentation process that will be the burning discomfort sensation that you experience. So again, we need that stomach acid, first line defense, to absorb nutrient minerals, and you need that stomach acid for protein digestion. So your stomach acid is made in the parietal cells, and your chief cells make your pepsinogen. So gastrin's going to release the stomach acid, it's going to help release the pepsinogen. But to activate pepsinogen, when that stomach acid is between that 1.5 and 3, you'll cleave off the immature pepsinogen to make it pepsin. Now pepsin can start breaking down the proteins to amino acids to start protein digestion. As well as the stomach acid is going to stimulate the pancreas to release all the pancreatic juices, the amylase, the lipase, the proteases, so we can start breaking down proteins, fats, and carbs. As well as that stomach acid will stimulate the release of picolinic acid from the pancreas. That picolinic acid is made in your liver and your kidneys, but it's stored in the pancreas. And when we have that stomach acid stimulation to the pancreas, it will release the picolinic acid into the blood, and the trace elements, when they're in the blood, can bind to the picolinic acid so that they can be bound, so that they can be absorbed into the tissues or the glands or whatever organ it needs to go to. So again, that stomach acid is paramount for how the pancreas is working, as well as for helping to release the bile. So stomach acid is orchestrating the pancreatic juices, the bile juices. It's our first line defense. It's needed for mineral and vitamin absorption, as well as for methylation. So we need those hydrogen ions to make our methyl groups, because a methyl group is 1 carbon and 3 hydrogens. So the stomach acid is giving us the abundancy of hydrogens so we can start making methyl groups. And you need these methyl donors, which becomes very important in activating certain genes. And you can do a whole chapter just on methylation, but stomach acid is absolutely needed for methylation. That stomach acid, as your first line defense, turns a macrophage into an aggressive macrophage so it can start eating things up. So again, stomach acid is absolutely critical. Now, how do I know if you have low stomach acid? When I look at a hair analysis and I see low sodium, low potassium, low zinc, low phosphorus, you can bet the house you are not making sufficient stomach acid. This is why the hair test is one of the most invaluable tools we have in all of functional medicine, because it's giving us the status of the nutrient minerals, the trace elements, the toxic metals, and indirectly tells us about, the adrenals, the thyroid, health trends, and stomach acid. So again, when we're making stomach acid, zinc is the all-star. Zinc is the Michael Jordan to making your stomach acid. But we need the role players, the bench players, we need the B1, we need the B6, and we always need the Fab 4. Calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium. And we're going to take a look at how the Fab 4 comes into the making of stomach acid. With the advent of oxygen hitting the planet billions of years ago, we needed a strategy to help deal with oxygen metabolism, because oxygen, that odorless, tasteless, invisible, mysterious, paradoxical element, oxygen, needs to be regulated. And so the regulation of oxygen is via the carbonic anhydrase enzyme, which is a zinc-dependent enzyme that makes your carbonic acid. So, big picture. Every time that we produce ATP, which is basically taking a glucose molecule, going through 22 steps to make your ATP. So that ATP is the universal currency that runs every cell of every living organism on planet Earth. So it is the universal currency, that ATP. So the byproduct of making ATP is carbon dioxide, CO2. CO2 is a very strong acid. You just can't dump it into the blood or you will alter the pH. Remember, pH, the potential of hydrogen, is the basis of all medicine, is regulated via the pH of the potential of hydrogen. And so the pH of blood is between 7.35 and 7.45. That blood pH cannot waver, not one iota, or you're dead. So we have the great acid-base balancing system, so we don't become too acidic or too alkaline. And this is happening via carbonic acid. So we take the CO2 that we produce as a result of, oxidative phosphorylation and producing that ATP. That CO2 diffuses into the blood, so inevitably it gets into the blood, but immediately in the blood plasma is mostly water, so it's going to react with water via the carbonic anhydrase zinc dependent enzyme to make carbonic acid. So what we're doing, we're taking a strong acid, carbon dioxide, turning it into a lesser acid, and as a lesser acid, this carbonic acid can now be dealt with. All right, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So this carbonic acid will either be broken down to a bicarb and a hydrogen, or it will be broken down to a water and a CO2, depending on which organ it's being dealt with. So we see this carbonic acid, when it goes to the kidneys, it's going to be dissociated into a bicarb and a hydrogen ion. That is your acid-base balance. That is why zinc is an alkaline mineral. This is making all your fluids in your body. Whatever fluid it is making, it's putting the fluid in the right pH, whether it's synovial fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, menstrual fluids, seminal fluids, digestive juices fluids, salivary fluids, tear fluids, every fluid, sweat fluids, all are dependent on the pH via this enzyme, via zinc. So every fluid in us is a result of that bicarbonate system. So this is how important zinc is. So just always keep in the back of your mind, zinc is the alkaline mineral to deal with the production of hydrogens. So hydrogen, like we said, is a proton, is an acid. So as a result of generating energy, we produce the acids, and we need to understand how to control the acids. So when we're dealing with a sugar, we're dealing with 12 hydrogens. So understanding how important this mechanism is critical. Now, the carbonic acid can be dealt with in the lungs, where it will be disassociated into a water and a carbon dioxide that we breathe out as a CO2 gas, as a water vapor. Beautiful. That's how we deal with it. When this carbonic acid, carbonic acid can go to a red blood cell, can go to the pancreas, can go to the lungs, the stomach, the kidneys. So the body has an intelligent way of dealing with the breakdown of glucose. Now, this carbonic acid, when it goes to the stomach via the enzyme carbonic anhydrase will dissociate into a bicarb and a hydrogen ion. And this is what we're going to look at in making your stomach acid. This is an amazing, biochemical process that is very interesting. So just remember, if this reaction can go this way, the reaction can go the other way. And so the basic byproduct of this will either be CO2 in water or bicarb and a hydrogen ion. That's kind of the take-home message. But just conceptualize of how many CO2 molecules you are producing of every day, of every single minute. You're producing gazillions of molecules of CO2. This is why we need to understand the status of zinc in the body. because we don't have zinc stores like we do for calcium and magnesium. We don't have the stores in the bones. Zinc, we lose 85% of our zinc just daily through digestion. So this is why understanding our need for zinc will give us a deeper appreciation for this spiritual warrior mineral, always protecting you, always fighting for you, always defending you. That is zinc. It is that spiritual warrior. It is one of the most amazing alkaline minerals that we have. So I just wanted to talk about this ancient enzyme, carbonic acid, how we deal with the strong acid, CO2 converting into a lesser acid, carbonic acid, and how it's going to be processed through different organ systems in the body. So we said zinc is the secretor because it's making all your fluids. We talked about that. Just a side note, let's say, we have a lot of arthritic aches and pains in our joints, elbows, knees, fingers, spine, neck, low back, wherever. When that synovial fluid pH is not in the optimal range, then those microbes can get in there and they can start eating at the bone that we call joint rot, that science calls arthritis or the rheumatoids or degenerative joint disease, or basically it's just a wasting away of our bones. So this is why we have to understand that zinc fluid connection. When we're making stomach acid, here we're looking at a parietal cell. Okay, so in a parietal cell, the first thing you notice is we got 5 protein channels. These protein channels are instrumental in how our physiology is working because most of the breakdown is happening in these protein channels. So we have a potassium channel, we have a chloride channel, we got the chloride bicarbonate antiporter channel, we got the sodium potassium pump, we got the hydrogen potassium pump, and whenever you see ATP, you must think magnesium. Okay, so we know that these channels are absolutely critical. So let's just take a peek at these channels so we have a better appreciation for them. So these protein channels are embedded into the cell membrane. Sometimes they can be laying in right just outside the cell membrane, and then with the stimuli of calcium per se, it can move the channel protein in. So you have some protein channels that are just in the cell membrane, some are just laying right next to it and just need a little stimuli to push it into the channel membrane. But understand that the cell membrane is where we need to have integrity, resiliency, and strength so we can deal with the oxidative stresses that will alter the cell membrane, altering the channel proteins. So these channel proteins in the cell membrane are critical. Remember that cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, mostly made up of cholesterol, fatty acids, and some phospholipids. And so this is the importance of that cholesterol made in the liver. So this is why all roads always lead to the liver. So these protein channels are absolutely critical. And we know that these heavy metals, mercury, cadmium, copper, displace the zinc. And if these metals get into these channels, it alters these channel proteins where the doors can't open, the doors can't close. So it alters the protein structure. So we don't get the passageway to get these nutrients in. And we know that mercury can block thousands of ions of zinc, cadmium can block thousands of ions of zinc. We have zinc, cadmium, and mercury, and they're very similar. So it's like you have a family, you got brothers, sisters, and parents where you have many similarities to your siblings, but you're uniquely different. Now, in this case, heavier metals will always displace the nutrient mineral. Now, if these heavy metals are just hitting the cell membrane, that causes oxidative stress, causing an autoimmune reaction. So we got to deal with these things that alter the cell membrane. So we talked about channelopathies, but let me just come back to the channelopathy. We know that channelopathies are, some of the ones we've studied in medicine are the genetic channelopathies where you can't get the glucose into the cell. So if you can't get glucose through the channel protein, then you starve. You know, the glucose has to get into the cell. Meanwhile, if these protein channels don't work, the glucose stays in the blood, destroying the blood. Meanwhile, the cell is starving for the glucose. So the chloride channel is when you have a genetic defect in the chloride channel. That is cystic fibrosis, because the chloride will come in, the sodium will leave. If the chloride can't come in, the sodium doesn't leave. So the sodium, wherever sodium goes, water goes. So that water, sodium, mucus buildup will become the suffocation and the death of you. And that happens with the cystic fibrosis when we have a genetic mutation in the chloride channel. Let's not forget, chloride channel is also needed for GABA. Alcohol can impede the chloride channel. The benzos impede the chloride channel. So this is an important concept to get, are these, you know, all these pumps. And so just looking at, just to make one, you know, amazing juice, that stomach acid, it takes 5 of these protein pumps, and that's where most of the breakdowns are happening, whether it's directly in the protein channel or it's on the cell membrane that's altering the structure of the protein channel. All right, so now let's look at the meat and potatoes of making this amazing stomach acid. So you have mitochondria in your parietal cells, because anytime you have ATP, you have a mitochondria. And part of that ATP is producing the byproduct of CO2. We also have CO2 that will actually just, you know, diffuse in from the plasma, and it will get into the cell. So we have that CO2 that will immediately react with water via the carbonic anhydrase zinc dependent enzyme to make your carbonic acid. So this carbonic acid, like I said, it's the acid-base balancer. And in this instance, in the parietal cell, it's making our stomach acid, because the carbonic acid will dissociate, where the hydrogen ion will go through this proton pump. So the hydrogen gets into the lumen of the gastric pit. So here we have half of the equation of the stomach acid. We have the hydrogen ion. So as the hydrogen ion comes in, the potassium comes out. And this potassium is always being recycled, because this is going on 1,000,000 times a second, and especially when we have food in us. So the potassium is being recycled via the sodium-potassium pump. So this sodium-potassium pump, we always talk about 3 sodiums coming out, 2 potassiums coming in. So they understand about this sodium-potassium ratio. In hair analysis, we have 60 years of clinical empirical observation, scientific study on the NAK ratio, one of the most important ratios in all of human physiology. So this NAK ratio, we love it to be at 2.5 to 5. This is the ratio that we find these pumps work optimally. When the NAK ratio gets too high, too many things are flooding in. When the ratio is too low, not enough things are getting in. So this is why in hair analysis, we're always looking at this ratio. So the other ratio we always have to look at is the calcium-magnesium. Remember I said we were going to look at the Fab4? Well, we see that the calcium-magnesium ratio is also critical. When we're making stomach acid, what I left out of the equation is the all-seeing brain is regulating absolutely everything. So to make stomach acid, we have to understand in making of stomach acid, we need the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic branch, mediated via the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve will influence acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, histamine, another neurotransmitter in a signaling molecule, and the hormone gastrin. So these are the players. So calcium will cause acetylcholine to be released. The acetylcholine will influence the histamine in the gastrin. So the gastrin and histamine will help these potassium pumps to be embedded with calcium, moving these into the right area on the cell membrane. So just understand that there's a very complicated mechanism with the whole chemical neuronal mediated transmission of making your stomach acid. So anything that inhibits parasympathetic will be an inhibitor. So the sympathetic stresses, the fight or flight, the emotional dramas, the depressions, the anxieties, the chemical stresses, the metal stresses, all will be too much sympathetic stimulation that will inhibit the parasympathetic stimulation of making your stomach acid. So that's the neuronal stuff. I don't want to get too deep into it because it is complicated, but just for simplicity, parasympathetic, vagus, acetylcholine, histamine, and gastrin are the main players in making of your stomach acid. So we talked about the hydrogen ion, so we got half the equation. Remember we said the hydrogens are good for methyl donors, we said a methyl group is a carbon and 3 hydrogens, so we can see this mechanism coming into play. All right, so the hydrogen dissociated, made it into where, we have half the ingredients to bake the cake to make that stomach acid. And then the other half of this carbonic acid, the bicarb, will be dissociated and it will get into the plasma via the chloride bicarbonate antiporter. Basically, an antiporter means something's coming in this way, something's going that way. That's basically, sodium potassium is also an antiporter mechanism. So the bicarbonate gets into the plasma, the chloride gets into the cell. What we're doing, we're trading a negative for a negative, so we don't alter the pH of the plasma nor the cell. And then this bicarbonate can go to where it needs to go, whether it's a red blood cell, the kidneys, the pancreas, the lungs, wherever. And in this instance, we're talking about, the parietal cell of the stomach. So now, the chloride gets in and it goes through this chloride channel. Remember, if you have a genetic mutation with cystic fibrosis, these chloride channels don't work. Benzos, alcohol inhibit these chloride channels. So that's why we need to understand about these channel proteins. So now the chloride gets in. Now we have the negative chloride and the positive hydrogen making that gastric juice, that amazing gastric juice, and we know what that juice does. So that is, in a simple nutshell, the making of your stomach acid mediated via zinc, mediated by the big four, and a deeper understanding of these protein channels. So that's what I wanted to talk about in this presentation. Should you have any questions, leave a comment and I will get back to every one of you. And thank you for watching my presentation and have a good day. Thank you.